The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I call the member for Longman.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And before I come to the detailed content of this bill, I would like to take up some issues from the former Speaker, the member for Blair. He said in the beginning of his speech, he sort of lectured this place about delivering budget surpluses, and he talks about consequences. Well, I think it's important in this place that we don't forget that the member for Blair was part of a government that promised the Australian people on literally hundreds of occasions that they would deliver a budget surplus, and yet they actually delivered the largest deficits we've ever seen. And as we're coming into government, we're inheriting hundreds of billions of dollars worth of debt. So if there is consequences for what you do in this place, I think it is actually incumbent upon us as members to be honest with the Australian people. And the member for Blair was part of a government that promised one thing hundreds of times and actually delivered the largest deficits we've ever seen as a nation. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, if I can come to the content of this bill, the Social Services and Other Legislation Amendment Bill. This bill is a multifaceted instrument addressing a range of significant social, welfare and workplace reforms. These changes are indicative of the Coalition's plans to not only return Australia to economic prosperity, but to restore a better supported, more functional and cohesive society. A nation where fiscal and social capital is spent wisely and not wasted, as we saw with the previous Labor government's penchant for tipping hundreds of billions of dollars into partly formed thought bubbles such as overpriced school halls and pink bats. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Social Services and Other Legislation Amendment Bill announces this government's intention to apply sober perspective in its approach to problem gambling. The Coalition does not for a moment back away from the contention that gambling is a major issue for some Australians, with those individuals and their families racked by trauma, upheaval and hardship of every description. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, at the same time, any response to gambling must recognise that many Australians gamble responsibly. Hard-working Australians trying to get ahead also rely on this sector for jobs, and legislation as it currently stands will place many venues under financial and regulatory stress. In my electorate, these businesses include the Caboolture Sports Club, which has grown from humble origins to become the region's premier community club. Last year named Brisbane's North's best club for the second time. The club opened its doors in 1997 after 6 local sporting groups representing softball, touch football, cricket, dog obedience, soccer and rugby union formed a single incorporation and raised the necessary finance. Since then, it has undergone rapid sporting and general membership growth and boasts superb bistros, bars, shows and events, and a new gambling room featuring 275 of the newest gambling machines. However, Caboolture Sports Club proudly remains a not-for-profit organisation driven by rusted-on core values aimed at enhancing the community. The club each year gives more than $1 million in both cash and in-kind support to a variety of local service groups, sporting groups, individuals and charities. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Caboolture Sports Club takes responsible gambling very seriously, with staff trained in the responsible service of gambling working in tandem with trained customer liaison officers who are on hand at all times to discuss help services available to their patrons. And this government is strongly of the view that counselling and research into problem gambling must be supported, not only in pursuit of effective help services for the gamblers, but to better root out the causes of this social ill. This roadmap towards responsible gambling has been our consistent direction. It is a path with too much writing on it to be politicised. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, duplicitous political expediency is exactly what underscored the previous Labor government's game of deal or no deal with the independent member for Denison. After the 2000 election, the former Labor Prime Minister Julia Gillard agreed to legislate the member's proposal on mandatory pre-commitment technology for poker machines in exchange for his support. His backing was required for Labor to hang on to the office of Prime Minister. Then, in a dramatic turn of events, the honourable member ripped up his contract to back the minority government when Ms Gillard refused to proceed with the policy lock, stock and barrel. Yet another of the discarded pledges that littered the Rudd-Gillard era. We should be able to trust our politicians to keep their word, the member for Denison said. And he said at the time, frankly, a deal is a deal. Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, the reason the former Prime Minister covered herself in dishonour by walking away from her agreement of convenience as her realisation that mandatory pre-commitment was untenable in the eyes of industry experts and, for that matter, most Australians. Mandatory pre-commitment, forcing gamblers to subscribe to daily betting limits, is tantamount to a licence to play. Aside from its draconian application, it has been unmasked as an utterly flawed policy. Since the introduction of mandatory pre-commitment in Norway in 2009, the number of compulsive gamblers has almost doubled, with many of them shifting from poker machines to other forms of betting, such as online gambling. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Coalition Government's considered approach to gambling addiction is targeted at reducing the problems, not fanning them. We will not be enacting mandatory pre-commitment of electronic gambling machines, but we do support a national voluntary pre-commitment program as part of a broader plan to assist problem gamblers. We will work with clubs and gaming venues on a realistic timetable for the introduction of venue-based voluntary pre-commitment. Another glaring inadequacy in the watered-down version of mandatory pre-commitment that Labor retreated to was that it was thrust on the national agenda without adequate consultation with the state and territory governments that actually carry the primary jurisdictional responsibility for gambling and also receive the revenue. Now we are left with a national regulatory system rubbing uncomfortably against that of the states and the territories. But under the amendments in this bill, the government will remove from the National Gambling Reform Act references to a proposed pre-commitment trial in the ACT and further cut duplication by restoring state and territory control over withdrawal limits on automatic teller machines in gaming venues. In slashing red tape, the Coalition is determined to install an overarching best practice gambling policy that will deliver real, meaningful and measurable support for problem gamblers. Mr Deputy Speaker, the National Gambling Regulator, established by Labor, notwithstanding the fact that every state and territory has gambling regulators, will be repealed under this bill. The levies which were to support its functions will also be scrapped. Our amendments to the National Gambling Reform legislation reinforce our election commitment to remove unnecessary regulatory duplication and to work with industry, state and territory governments, academia and the community to sustain responsible gambling. It is critical that any effective policy response to problem gambling be trained on all its forms, not just poker machines, or we run the risk, as we have seen in Norway, of chronic gamblers substituting one form of betting for another form. Funds freed from the shutdown of the National Gambling Regulator will be diverted into additional counselling and treatment services for Australians who have problems with their gambling and need understanding and genuine help and support. Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill also proposes reforms to paid parental leave, or PPL, that will cut businesses a big break on the compliance burden they have suffered under the previous Labor government scheme. Put simply, small businesses will no longer be required to do the government's hard yards on administering paid parental leave. The reform is not only significant, but emblematic of the Coalition's drive to eliminate red tape and administrative costs that are costing the Australian economy at least $1 billion a year. Currently, employers are forced to act as unpaid pay clerks after receiving an employee's paid parental leave entitlement from Centrelink. This system is unnecessarily complex and forces small businesses to bear the cost of the extra workload and of restructuring their payroll and accounting systems. Employers will still be able to opt in to manage PPL for their workers if both parties agree to do so. But unless so specified, these changes will see parents paid their leave directly by the Department of Human Services from March 1 next year. Mr Deputy Speaker, this government knows that employers don't need extra paperwork and they certainly don't need the cash flow problems that have arisen as a result of a bureaucratic quagmire that Labor created with its parental leave scheme. In fact, on top of the world's largest carbon tax, the departed Labor government instituted more than 40 other new or increased taxes and 21,000 new regulations. Local small businesses need the confidence to grow, invest and create jobs, but they can't do this while they're being punitively taxed and regulated. Mr Deputy Speaker, the reason we still have people entering small business is because they desire autonomy and flexibility. They want to be the masters of their own fate, and they certainly don't have the human resource departments to cope with mountains of senseless paperwork. And the more you stifle small business, you strike at innovation and at creativity. You're choking the potential of small businesses to go into the big businesses of the future. And that's why the Coalition is steadfastly sticking to its program of dismantling unwarranted and excessive regulation. We know just how much it will help our local businesses to be able to breathe and grow again. Mr Deputy Speaker, these amendments to the administration of paid parental leave in this bill are an important antecedent to this government's new landmark paid parental leave scheme, due to be given effect from July 1, 2015. Mothers will be provided with 26 weeks leave based on their actual wage, instead of the current scheme paying 18 weeks at the national minimum wage. It means that more women will be eligible for PPL, that payments will be made over a longer period, and the overwhelming majority of women will receive a higher payment because it is based on real earnings, not an indiscriminate minimum wage. Those earning the average full-time salary for women will be more than $21,000 better off. Mr Deputy Speaker, we are fast approaching a crossroads. Our ageing population and the rising associated costs of health, aged care and welfare poses an intergenerational challenge of epic proportions. Women entering the workforce triggered the biggest productivity gain of the past 30 years. Today, there is no equivalent labour force impetus lying untapped. But over the longer term, this government's paid parental leave scheme can only help defend Treasury coffers from the buffeting that is coming with demographic change. The Coalition scheme has been designed to keep women in the workforce. If more people are in better jobs, earning higher real wages, remarkably, they pay more tax. And effectively, our PPL scheme is a productivity increasing measure. Mr Deputy Speaker, finally, I would like to briefly turn the House's attention to a matter close to my heart: the implementation of a genuine national disability insurance scheme. This bill imparts a layer of security for some of our most vulnerable. It introduces measures that ensure the funding for reasonable and necessary supports under a participant support plan can only be used for the purpose of purchasing support. The amendments in effect make the NDIS amounts protected. They prevent third parties from recovering debts through garnishing NDIS participants' bank accounts that are kept for the sole purpose of managing their support funding. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Coalition has an unflinching support to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. We will deliver the announced spending on the scheme and honour the agreements in place between the Commonwealth and the states and territories for its full rollout. As I have said in this place before, improving disability was one of my prime motivators for getting into politics. I have a close friend, Pat, who suffers from spinal muscular atrophy, and I worked as his participation assistant. I have seen firsthand the obstacles and roadblocks thrown up by an overly bureaucratic disability system, a system focused on process instead of outcome. Australia's late great Prime Minister Sir Robert Menzies envisaged a society made all the richer by its obligations to its most vulnerable. The purpose of all measures of social security, he said, is not only to provide citizens with some reasonable protection against misfortune, but also to reconcile that provision with their profound independence and dignity as democratic citizens. The time has gone when social justice should even appear to take the form of social charity. It is in this spirit that the National Disability Insurance Scheme should capture, ensuring every Australian has equal opportunity to live a better, more dignified and more productive life. Mr Deputy Speaker, we all deserve our shot at the brightest possible future, irrespective of circumstances, and that's what the National Disability Insurance Scheme will deliver. I thank the House.